Welcome back for the fifth and final video of our Writing Great Scenes series. So over the past few weeks, we've been going over what are the main elements of a scene. How do you write a character's goal or desire? How do you write conflict in a scene and really ramp it up so that readers are turning pages into the night? And then our last video, we discussed the actual structure of a scene, the beginning, middle, and end, and how do you create scene cards from your structure and from your ideas. So today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of pull back and take an eagle eye view, and we're going to say, how do you take any scene cards that you've created and create an entire novel out of it? So this is going to be a fun video. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. So first things first, I do want to stress the fact that you don't actually need to or have to make scene cards for your novel. You don't have to plot things out in advance. Some people love it. It works for some writers to know their story before they get started and be able to just write from a stack of scene cards, and it doesn't work for other writers. So your job is to learn as much as you can and then figure out your own unique process, and don't judge yourself. If you don't use scene cards, totally fine. You can still write a novel that is amazing. Where some people tend to use their note cards is not in the writing process, but in the editing process, when they've got their novel, but it's still kind of a mess and they want to really put it all in order. So whether you're looking at this video as a way to get a better handle on your writing process or your editing process, it's my hope not to tell you how I think you should do it, but how I do it, and hope that you can pull something from that or that it helps you in some way. So I realized when I was sort of outlining this video that this is a difficult thing to explain, your process of how you get your ideas and how you string them together into a novel. So I'm going to do the best that I can, but definitely let me know down in the comments below if this resonated with you, if anything, you're missing a piece of it, or you want to see the process with more examples, because I would be happy to talk about that more in the future. But one of the first things that I like to do when I already have created some of the scene cards is I will take an eagle eye view by looking at my plotting method and the different plot points that I'm trying to hit and pairing my scene cards up with those major plot points. This is what's going to help me identify where's the holes, where are the gaps, where I need to figure out how do we get from point A to point B, because I don't have those scenes filled out yet. And so I personally use the 3-act structure. So I'm looking for things like, what's the opening hook image? What's the argument against transformation? Where is my mystery introduced or the antagonist introduced? And what's the first doorway? And then I'll ask things like, what is the midpoint or the big climax that happens in the center of the novel? What is that Act 2 doorway that leads us into the all is lost moment and that final climax? So I'm going to be looking, as I sort through the note cards that I've already created from last week's video, and I'm going to start pairing those up with those plot points. There are so many different methods of plotting a novel. So I use the 3-act structure. If you want to hear more about what I use, or you want to download my free workbook on how to plot your novel, I will link all of that down for you below, because I have a whole series of videos on that plotting method. But maybe you use Save the Cat, maybe use the snowflake method. There are so many different methods of plotting and different terminology that you can use. So it doesn't matter which one you're using, just the one that resonates for you. Start with your stack of note cards and start pairing them up with those plot points. Then I'll also, like I said, I'll put them in chronological order. And of course, there are stories sometimes that aren't fully chronological, so you might have to play with that depending on the novel you're writing. So my book, The Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, that I've been working on in the past, is told in alternate timelines. You have a chronological order of the present, and then you have a chronological order of what's happening in the past, and then you have to weave those together. So what I would do in that case is I would create one timeline chronologically and then another, and then I would start pairing them up with my plot to weave them together for maximum drama in the story. Then you could say, okay, when you start looking, you could say, what are the most dramatic scenes? What scenes are going to create the most change in the trajectory of the story or in my character's life or their need to grow? And these are going to be usually scenes that are related to your genre. So if you're writing a mystery, what's the most dramatic mystery moment? It's going to be a dead body. It's going to be a huge new clue that just throws the story in a whole new direction. If you're writing a romance, it's going to be that first kiss or the first time they tell each other they love each other. So you can pair up the most dramatic scenes with those big plot points, right? Because if you have the first dead body on the page, maybe that is your opening scene or your opening hook, or it could be the introduction of the mystery the first time we see a dead body, right? Usually the most dramatic scenes in your book are gonna pair up with those big plot points, right? The first time your couple kisses might be the doorway into Act 2. So often I'll look for those big moments or the big moments where my character is going to be thrown for a loop or they're going to be asked to change or something like that. What are the biggest obstacles that my character is going to face? Chances are the biggest ones are going to be that climax moment or some other big moment in your story. Okay, so let's talk about what do you do though if you don't actually know any scenes yet? You just kind of have a mostly unformed idea of what's happening in this story. So every writer starts kind of differently in how they develop stories. For me, I usually see a moment or a scene in the book. It'll be a witch walking with roses trailing behind her and it sparks something. So there's usually, for me, starts with a scene, but some people start with a setting and some people start with a character. And so wherever you start, what I recommend is writing down as much as you can see or imagine in your mind about that story so far. And from that journaling and that sort of brain dump, you're going to start to naturally come up with scenes or scenarios or conversations that are going to happen in your story. And so when you start doing that, I kind of treat it like a meditation in a way. So I will actually get myself into a really calm state of mind, a creative state of mind. And I just close my eyes and I start to imagine that character going through their life. What is the main story here? And again, this is going to be often guided by the genre that you're writing. Now, if you don't know which genre you're writing, that's something you'll want to figure out kind of early on. Like, what's the shape of this story? Am I writing a romance? In that case, I need to start thinking about romantic scenes and who this, how this couple gets together. What are the obstacles between them? If you're writing a young adult paranormal fantasy, then there's going to be some kind of magic system in here. And there's going to be some kind of conflict, maybe with an evil creature or some kind of big bad, right? So the genre and the type and the shape of story that you're writing is going to start to naturally bring up scenes, scenarios, and dialogue for you. And then what I'll often do is just sit in silence. And sometimes I come back to this several days in a row and make sure that you have either your note cards or a notebook nearby so that you can write out any image that comes to mind, every single thing captured on the page, because even just a snippet of a girl walking through a closet, touching these beautiful white clothes might be an entire scene in your book that could be pivotal. So don't discount anything, write it all down. And then what I do is I ask myself the following questions. Who is my character at the beginning of this book? Like, who are they? And what's going to be their main obstacle in this book? What problem are they going to have to solve? Who are they going to meet? These kinds of questions. And then I'll say, what's their goal? What's their goal and what's standing in their way? And why does it matter to them? Why do they care? So this is very much those ideas of like, what's your character's goal? What's their motivation? What's their reason why? And what's the obstacle to it? And then I'll also be asking myself, and what's at stake here? Like, who is this person that if they fail at reaching their goal, they're going to, what's at stake? They're going to lose their family. They're going to live their life unhappy. They're never going to break free of their past. Like, what is at stake for them? And then I will write down a list often of what's the worst thing that could happen to this character in relationship to this goal and the obstacle that's facing them. Is it death? Is it you know, that they lose their family, that they lose their job. You know, what is it that I can write out that's going to be like from bad to worst to absolute worst and devastation? Because sometimes that will spark scene ideas like, oh yeah, she's got to lose her job. So that'll be the act one climax. She's going to lose her job because of this guy. And now she has to confront him and then they fall in love, like whatever it is. But that will start to spark things for you. Once you've started sparking things, then go back to last week's video with scene structure and see if you can fill out scene cards that tell you, well, here's the overview of the scene. Here's my character's goal in the scene. Here's the conflict that they're facing, and here's the outcome that leads us into the next scene. So once you have some of that stuff, now you're caught up with us over here with our stack of scene cards, and then go through the previous process of pairing those up with those major plot points. So the next part of the process for me is filling in the gaps. So for this section, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move to a top-down view, and I'm going to share with you some scene cards that I created just for this that are about my book, The Witch's Key. So since we were going through this as an example last week, I'll continue on with that. So I'll share with you some of the scene cards that I might have to start out with and how I identify and fill in the gaps. Okay, I'm excited to share this process with you of how I go from just like 1 or 2 note cards to having a plot for my entire novel and then writing the book. So this is my plotting notebook. So I tend to have this and my note cards kind of all the time. I also have a workbook where I have some stuff about the characters and then all the plotting points that I tend to look for in a story. So if you want a copy of this, you can sign up for my newsletter and it's inside my resource library. Okay, so I already tried to record this once, which is why you see some of these numbers on here, and I don't want to remake the note cards, but bear with me here for just a minute. Let's say after my brainstorming and meditation, I know 3 things that are happening in the first act. Let's say I know for sure that Peyton, Lenny's new friend, is going to get kidnapped, because the shape of this story is that there are girls who've been kidnapped. Lenny knows that it's something paranormal involved, and she doesn't want to get involved, argument against transformation, because that's how her parents died, was doing this kind of work. But she also has to, because she cares so much about this new friend that she feels like she needs to look into it to save her friend. So this is going to be the key event. This will be the thing that draws my character into the story. And sometimes when I'm plotting, I start with those big dramatic moments. Okay, this is the shape of the story. Her friend is kidnapped. Now the rest of the story, she's going to investigate this murder. So if I know this scene, that Peyton's kidnapped, and this is when Lenny finds out about it, and this is when she decides that she's going to investigate, I know that's the first doorway of no return and the key event. So I can kind of match up what I have so far on note cards with any type of plot point I might have on this list. So let's say I only know 2 other scenes. I know that I've got a scene idea where Lenny's arriving at school and she first meets Peyton. So where does that belong? That could be my opening scene. So I'll kind of set that here. And then I can see in my head a scene where this tall, dark, mysterious guy that she meets named Kai is confronting her about kind of getting involved in things that she doesn't understand. So he's standing out in front of her house. This is one of those scenes that I could like see in my head. He's standing there, but why? I may not know 100% yet. So that's chronologically going to happen somewhere between her seeing him for the first time in this scene and Peyton getting kidnapped. Because I'm kind of setting him up as a potential like red herring / partner in this whole thing. So if I know these 3 scenes, where I would start with this is I would ask myself, okay, I've got these chronologically, but is this scene the first scene of my novel? She's cast this invisibility spell. She's arriving at school. When I start to think through it, I really know that I need to set up her relationship with Uncle Martin, her uncle that she's been staying with since her parents died. And I want to set up the title of the book, The Witch's Key, her magic powers. And I want to make sure the reader knows right from the start how Lenny's parents died, like introduce that mystery of what happened to her parents. So my opening scene or my hook is not going to be this arriving at school, but instead it's going to be just a brief scene where she's getting ready for school and Uncle Martin gives her back her witch's key, which unlocks her magic that the council has been keeping from her as they've investigated her parents' death. So this tells us that she's been cleared of any wrongdoing and she has access to her magic again. And so this is kind of a foundational scene, and it's much more of a hook of a scene because we get introduced to this cool idea of magic being locked behind a key. So that's going to be my opening scene. So I would label this as a 1. I wouldn't put Lenny's name up here at the top because I don't have multiple POV, but if I was writing lots of different characters, I would color code these with the character's name here at the top. So I know this is the opening scene. This scene is the next scene. So she casts the invisibility spell and now she goes to school, but Peyton sees through it. So I've got those two. The next scene that I know is Kai confronting her. Well, at the end of this scene, she's just now seeing him for the first time. So I definitely have a gap here because he has nothing to confront her for yet. I also have a massive gap between her just meeting Peyton and her caring enough about Peyton that she's willing to literally risk her life to save her. So I need a few things. I need a reason for Kai to confront her, and I need a reason for her to care so much about Peyton that she's willing to risk her life. So I need a series of scenes that form this purpose, right? All while also setting up any of the mystery that I happen to know later in the story. Are there any other red herrings or potential witnesses, potential further victims? What else do I need to set up before we get out of Act 1 to make the rest of the story work? So for one thing, I need to set up some situations where she's getting closer to Peyton, right? So throughout this, depending on what your story is, you might be asking yourself questions about, are there any other relationships that need to be set up before we move into Act 2? Are there any other pieces of the mystery, like clues or potential red herrings or potential culprits, like bad guys, that we need to set up here? If it's a romance, are there any points of where our character is now that I need to show what they're faced with now so that I can properly show their transformation later in the story? And if it's a, fantasy or something, you might want to be setting up the world building a little bit more, or setting up how your character's life is now and how that's going to lead into their grand adventure or whatever it may be. But as you start going through it chronologically, you should be able to ask yourself, is there anything between this scene and this scene that needs to come into the story? Relationships, mysteries, all of that. So I would add some scenes here. So for example, I would say, okay, I want to have a scene, like in my head, I just let whatever envisions, come up for me, I will use. So I'll say, oh, I can see the girls sitting together at a coffee shop. What if there was a really fun, cool coffee shop that all the cool kids go to after school? Let's call it Sir Bean, which is going to be really fun because they're the Newcastle Knights. And it'll be kind of a funny little place that they love to hang out. So Peyton at school invites Lenny to Sir Bean. And this happens maybe at lunch or something like that, just a brief scene where she invites her to go. So one thing is, I wouldn't necessarily need, after she gets to school, to have scenes that walk her chronologically through the day. We don't need to see her going to the bathroom and going to math class and going to lunch unless there's some kind of piece of that scene that moves the story forward towards these bigger plot points, right? So if I'm going to have a scene where Peyton invites Lenny to Sir Bean, it probably also needs to have some kind of conflict or some kind of extra to it. So I might want to brainstorm that later and say, well, maybe Uncle Martin doesn't allow her to go, or maybe she has some other kind of conflict. So I may not know that, but I'll put the placeholder here that she's got an invitation. And then after that, I'm going to actually show them going to Sir Bean. So at this particular scene, I would write down a bunch of notes because there's a lot of things that are going to happen at this coffee shop, not only tying into the fact that Kai works there, and Lenny gets this crazy idea that if she could get some saliva from him, from his straw, she could do a little magical spell on him that she could tell what kind of creature he is. Maybe he's a vampire, maybe he's a demon, and she wants to know. And so her curiosity gets the better of her and she steals his straw. So dun, 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 now I have something for him to confront her with. So is there anything that needs to happen between her stealing the straw and finding out more about the mystery and him confronting her? Well, let's say she has to do something with the straw, right? Do I want her to actually cast the spell and figure out what kind of creature he is? Maybe. So that's how I would start building my scenes is what happens? Then what? What next? What next? Is there anything I need to do to fill in these gaps? And spoiler alert, she does cast a spell on the straw, but it doesn't say what he is. So the mystery continues to thicken around this guy. Then he's standing out in front. He confronts her. And now I've connected that opening scene with the next scene that I knew in my story. And what happens here is one of the big things that she realizes in the conflict and the outcome of this scene is that one, he's just as scared as she is, which is a surprise to her. And two, he knows about what happened to her family, which just increases the mystery around this guy and is going to have a reaction from her. So as you're plotting through, you might also be thinking about how does my character react to this scene? And that can lead you into what happens next. So then I would ask okay, so is there any other thing that needs to happen with Kai or Uncle Martin or her magic? Or are there any other characters that need to be introduced? And is her relationship to Peyton strong enough to justify this big leap? I don't think so just yet. So maybe I'm going to add another scene. Maybe I would add another couple scenes here where she has another night with Peyton, or they share some kind of emotional moment that really ties my character in. Not just, hey, we're hanging out at a coffee shop, but she gets to know something about Peyton's past that resonates with her, that makes her deeply care for this girl. And so I would just build my scenes like that and write it. Sit down and write it. And once this first act was done, I'm probably going to have ideas as to what's going to happen in the second act and what's the reaction, what's the plan, what's the other attacks that happen, and so on. And that's basically how I create my note cards and go through it. And it's a difficult process to kind of explain, but I sincerely hope that this was helpful for you and that it helps you gain a little bit of clarity on what to do. So it's not so much a matter of following your character day to day through every little thing they do, but it's about really identifying what are the big moments of the story that I need to set up, and then bridging the gap or filling in the gaps between the character's motivation and the clues that need to come in and the relationships that need to be established in order to make the story flow in a logical manner. So that's how I do it. Now that we have our scene cards, we've filled in as many of the gaps as possible. You can trust that when you feel excited to start writing and you really start to see it play through your mind, that you're ready to start working on either your edits or your writing. For me, I don't have every scene filled out from the beginning of the story all the way to the end. I will have a stack usually of scene cards that are scattered throughout the entire story when I start filling in the gaps. And then usually I'll try to fill in every scene that happens in Act 1. And once I have all of Act 1 figured out, and then I have a little bit of Act 2, and then I figure out kind of where I think the climax is going to be, usually I'm ready to start writing. Now, for some writers, you might fill out every single 40, 50 note cards for the entire scenes before you even start writing. For some of you, you don't need these scene cards at all until your edits, and that's okay. Your process is your process, so honor that and be proud of yourself and keep moving forward. So my process is having those kind of major plot points for the end of the story, but having as much of Act 1 as possible down. So then once I'm ready to write, I come armed with my detailed scene cards. Usually I will put a little hole punch right here in the corner. I'll put them on one of those book rings so that I don't lose them or they don't get out of order when my daughter comes to play with them and write on them and all those kinds of things. And I will sit down, get myself into a place where I'm ready to write. And I will look at the scene that I'm going to be writing today, or the scene that I'm going to write first. And I almost always start with a movie in my head. So I will close my eyes and I will imagine my character playing through that scene like it's a movie in my head. And I will listen for any dialogue that comes up, any character that comes up. And I don't have to play through the whole scene, but I'll just play through the opening of that scene. What's that hook of that scene? So Lenny's going to school for the first day. She thinks she's invisible. No one's noticing her. And then here comes this bubbly blonde girl who notices her and won't stop talking to her. And that's all I need, is that visual in my head. I'm a very visual person, and I am ready to write. So I will, as I sit down to write, I will make sure that that opening hook is in my mind as a scene the reader can. So then I'm ready to sit down. So I will have that visual in my head, make sure that it feels like a hook, that it, I'm writing it to make sure that it brings the reader in and draws them in. And then I focus on, as I'm going through it, what's the obstacle and how does my character feel as they're moving through this? And of course, there's really no way to plan out every single word that's going to be said, because once you've done that, you've already written the book. So just trust as those voices flow through your head, as those scenes flow through your head, just write what's on the page. And remember that you can always change it later. Just because it's on a scene card doesn't mean this is the way it has to be. And a lot of times, the reason that I don't plot so far ahead to the later ends of the book is because as I'm writing, the scenes changed. I thought this was going to be about Peyton, but here's this other guy and he's mysterious. And where did he come from? And sometimes that's the most exciting part, is when a new character is revealed or a new mystery comes up or a new conflict comes up. So have that visual in your head and make sure that you're focused as you begin writing on, okay, the opening really draws my reader in, and then I'm going to focus on the conflict, both the internal conflict going on inside my character. She doesn't want to be seen. This is not how things were supposed to go, but also that external conflict. Wow, there's these missing girls. Everybody's on edge. Everybody's scared. And here's this new guy who happened to arrive at school right at the time these girls started going missing. And now he's staring right at you. Like, I focus on that level of conflict so that I'm pulling that thread through as I'm writing. And every word, every conversation is leading me toward that outcome of the scene. And I've got that in my mind as I'm writing. And this is such a difficult thing to really explain the process because it's so intuitive and personal to each person. But I think that's the best way I can do it, is I have my mind on the conflict and what's going on in my character, like inside my character, and their emotions and their feelings. But I'm always thinking about every moment is leading me to that outcome. He's standing there and he's staring right at you. And I'm building up to that, both in my pacing, in my conversation, and in the movement of my character. If it's a scene that really shakes my character to their core in some way, I also will make sure that I add a little sequel moment where they process what just happened. They figure out where to go next. And so that's kind of a scene transition that I don't always have written on my scene cards, but it's more of an intuitive thing. Like, okay, I need a little bit of processing moment here, and now I'm going to move on to the next scene. So once a scene is finished, I will look at my note cards and I will say, does this make sense to move straight to that? Or do I need something to bridge the gap? And sometimes when I'm plotting and planning, I can't see that. I need to already have the scene on the page and know how it unfolded and flowed to be able to see, okay, what happens next? Okay, I need a scene here where she's got to go talk to her teacher, or she needs to reach out to Uncle Martin because this has really shaken her up. And so I just will create new scene cards so that when I'm going through my edits, I have a record of what actually happened in the story. And I don't judge if something needs to change. And I always keep in mind that I'm just writing a rough draft. Maybe if this scene doesn't belong, I can delete it later or change it. If I decide, okay, now I know what the next scene is, I make sure when I sit down to write that next scene that I acknowledge any passage of time, any change in setting, and I start again with a new hook. So if it's the end of the school day and now they're at Sabine, I make sure that I let the reader know right away that we're no longer at school. It's a few hours later and they're at this coffee shop, and I can use all the senses. So I'll think about the noise in the coffee shop, the people, the way that Lenny feels as she's sitting there, and I'll focus on the conversation with the people that she's sitting with at the table. And so that kind of thing will draw your reader into that scene and create a smooth transition from one scene to the next. And then that's basically how I write a novel. So I will have all those scenes figured out, fill in the gaps, and I will sit down and write them. As I'm writing, it's a fluid thing. Plot is ever changing, ever shifting. So every time I finish a scene, I'll ask myself, does this change what I had planned? And if so, how? And I'll really just trust that inner voice, that intuition that says, you need a more calm scene before you jump into this action, or you need a moment between these two if you're going to strengthen their relationship before you move on to the next piece of action, or there's a conversation that needs to happen to make this logically flow. And I will just follow that as I write my rough draft. And every time I end a scene, I reevaluate, see how it feels, move on to the next scene, and make sure that there's a good flow. And sometimes if I can't figure out the jump or the flow, then I just keep moving forward, and I can fix that in my edits. And so that's a video for another day. But I write my entire novel this way. I'm always thinking about what's my character's goal, who are they in this scene, who are they becoming, who are they transforming into, and what is the outcome that I'm leading to? What's that symbol crash or that new discovery or that thing that's going to change the story or change them? And then I flow my way to it, take a pause, try to figure out what happens next, and I just keep moving forward. By the time I get to the end of my Act 1 scene cards, usually I've already got more ideas. So I will take a moment and I will start writing out, okay, what's their reaction to this? How am I going to get them from here to the midpoint? And I basically go through that same process I was talking about before, where I fill in the gaps by going through the steps. What needs to be set up now? How do I play off of what happened before and bring that in as a thread? And it becomes a very back and forth process between my scene cards, my plot, my rough draft so far, and just make my way through the entire novel that way. So I know, I wish I could give more details, but I think that's the best way I can explain it. So I hope this look at the scene cards, how I fill in the gap, and how I get into the mental space of writing has been helpful for you. And in fact, I hope this entire scene series has been helpful for you. If it has, definitely make sure that you subscribe to this channel, share this video series with a friend, sign up for my newsletter, and get all of those free resources like the scenes workbook, the plotting workbook. There's even an editing workbook if you're ready for that part of it. Comment down below and let me know what other series on writing you would like to have. I know we've had people requesting series on how to write in backstory or how to write in sexual tension or subplots and different things like that. So go ahead and leave a comment down below about what you thought of this series, what other resources you have about scenes, and what videos you would love to see in the future, because we do have Preptober coming up in just a couple of months and lots of other things. So I am excited for all that's to come. Thank you for hanging out with me during this series, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.